Hello and welcome to the Weekly Defence Podcast, the show about defence procurement and military technology. We are brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Nammo. I'm your host, Richard Thomas, Senior Editor Naval, and in the news this week, it has emerged that the US DoD has established 5 new ethical principles to operate in a future where AI technologies are fielded at scale. This follows an 18-month development effort. Implementation will be key, with the military preparing for a sustained and thorough process. A steering group with the US DoD will provide procurement guidance, test and evaluation capabilities, training strategies, and a range of other measures. What is clear is that the use of AI presents ethical ambiguities, risks, and unique challenges for all the services. Also in the US, efforts continue to protect military UAV operations from electromagnetic attack. DARPA is bringing its Collaborative Operations in Denied Environments, or CODE initiative, to a conclusion, with the program transitioning to NAVAIR supervision. CODE software will allow a UAV to retain its mission data and continue to perform tasks even if the electromagnetic environment becomes contested or congested. No details have been released as to when the program might conclude, although it is reasonable to assume that elements of the CODE software may begin to transition to existing and new UAVs over the coming years. In Europe, NATO held a virtual press conference to launch its latest annual report, which outlined some of the impact the COVID-19 pandemic was having on the alliance and efforts to mitigate its spread at its Brussels HQ. Let's listen to a clip from NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg.
When we speak about the long-term consequences, that is too early to say anything with certainty about what the long-term consequences will be. When NATO allies decided to invest more in defense, they did so because we live in a more uncertain, more unpredictable world, and therefore we need to invest more in defense. This has not changed. So I expect allies to stay committed to investing more in our security. And by investing more in our security, in our armed forces, we're also providing surge capacity for all our societies to deal with unforeseen events, crises, natural disasters, as we, for instance, see now. Because we see that in many NATO allied countries, the armed forces are actually providing support to the civilian society. By investing in our military, we also provide a capacity which has proven useful in supporting the civil society dealing with crises like the corona crisis.
Moving on, the Czech Republic is improving the mobility and situational awareness of its ground forces. The Czech MOD has announced the delivery of 4 new command, staff and communication variants of the 8x8 Panda II to provide better communication on the battlefield. The vehicles were procured under a $650 million contract awarded to Tatra Defence Vehicle in 2017. On the naval side, senior former UK defence officials have said that the country should renew its MCM fleet once the current Hunt and Sandown classes leave service, given the importance of their role in the Arabian Gulf in offering a key capability that its US ally relies heavily upon. The Royal Navy operates 2 Hunt-class and 2 Sandown-class MCM vessels in the Gulf, with the primary role of defeating any attempted mining of the strategic Strait of Hormuz, through which much of the world's oil is carried. This is a crucial task given the UK's demand for resources and the 39 million tonnes of oil imported into the country each year. Just 6 of the ageing Hunt class are still in service following the decommissioning of Atherstone and Quorn in 2017, with the oldest remaining vessel, HMS Ledbury, having accumulated 39 years of service to date. Mark Cancian, senior advisor with the US-based Centre for Strategic and International Studies, told Shepherd that the US had, for a long time, counted on its allies to provide MCM capabilities. On the air side, this week, the German MOD and industrial base reported that key domestic procurements continue to run as scheduled, although the outbreak of COVID-19 is causing catastrophic disruption to international operations. To discuss this, I'm joined by Air Editor Tim Martin. Tim, hi.
Hi, Rich.
So, Tim, this week you took a look at the implications for the German MOD with the COVID-19 virus and the potential changes to key acquisitions. What more can you tell us about this?
So I suppose probably first worth pointing out in terms of operationally, the Army are assisting with assisting healthcare services by but mainly through medical equipment, by transport of medical equipment, I should say, and also helping to set up testing sites for the virus. And then wider issues from the government kind of include temporary restriction on cross-border traffic from France, Austria, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Denmark. But yeah, as you mentioned, at an acquisition level as well, Germany are saying there's no substantial changes to procurement. But I dug into that a little bit deeper because I asked some from industry about what's been happening at their level. And so, for example, we're talking in terms of what Germany are looking for and what they're moving through from a procurement point of view. We're really talking about the Tornado fighter jet replacement here, which is critical at the moment. New heavy lift helicopters as well, and then F-125 frigates as well on the naval side. So yeah, I guess if we begin with Tornado, it's, as we know, a legacy fighter, and Eurofighter and the F-18 are in play to put forward an aircraft to replace it. And according to Airbus, that hasn't, they didn't say this, but I'm reading between the lines that the contract decision award that was due to happen at the end of March at the latest hasn't quite gone ahead to schedule, because they've said that from what they understand, there's not going to be any imminent decision being announced on that front. So that is a small suggestion here that that behind the scenes all isn't too well on the procurement front. And as you say, that's despite words kind of to the contrary from the German MOD, who have expressly said that there's no major changes happening to major timelines as far as they're concerned. And that's also having been in discussions with their main suppliers and partners.
What about on the rotary side of things? Obviously, Germany's looking to get some key heavy lift rotaries. So any impact on COVID-19 on those procurement processes?
There doesn't appear to be at the moment, because as we know, the bids have made their way to the German MOD from both Boeing and from Sikorsky. So Boeing pitching with the Chinook, of course, and Sikorsky with the 53K King Stallion. There's a wide window here as well on that one, because the contract award isn't until 2021. So given the fact that most of the main developments on that front have already now happened in terms of the request for information and the proposals, you'd have to think that the 2021 date perhaps if it is delayed slightly, would be understandable, but at the moment there doesn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary on that one.
Okay, what about on the naval side? We spoke last week about the impact that COVID-19 is having on some of the shipyards like Fincantieri and Navantia and some shipyards here in the UK. What did TKMS have to say for themselves on the F-125?
Yep, so they said it's in effect business as usual. They've been in direct contact with the government and taken all necessary precautions to maintain high standards of hygiene. But shipbuilding is going ahead as planned, and they expect that the third frigate from the F-125 programme and the fourth will be delivered second half of 2020 for the third, and in 2021 then for the fourth. And yeah, I was in direct contact with TKMS, and that's kind of really what they had to say. And I suppose, though, what is probably worth mentioning is the fact that the site for the F-125 build is in Hamburg, and Hamburg has been proportionally hit very hard with the coronavirus across compared to other places in Germany. Not that I'm kind of surmising from that, not that this is something that TKMS have come forward and said, but you would have to think that there's extremely stringent health protocols in place, given the fact that, Hamburg, as I say, has been very severely affected, and in terms of the numbers of infections that have been reported by area in Germany.
I mean, it would be a significant industrial effort for TKMS to turn that program around, while at the same time having to contend with potential repercussions with COVID-19, because the first one or two ships in that build suffered through some faulty hardware and software. So as I say, that'd be a pretty remarkable turnaround in the face of what looks like a pretty adverse working environment for the company, don't you think?
Definitely. I mean, I think probably on the management side, they're keeping their fingers crossed that what the outside observers are suggesting, there's going to be prolonged impact here, that it'll be kept to a minimum, because, as you mentioned on the problems previously, the German Navy had returned the first in class, the F125 previously. So I think they're certainly going to be looking at this and making sure that TKMS are focused and that the deadlines are met, particularly after the problems that you've mentioned previously. So you'd imagine then that there's a lot riding on this, and that they'll see through the storm and come out the other end okay.
Any other signs that difficulties might lie ahead from a procurement perspective?
Yeah, I certainly think that as I mentioned with Tornado in particular, Airbus, and this is, I think, quite unusual in terms of some of the more guarded responses that you often get from industry on this side. They did mention that there's as they understand it, there's no imminent change or no imminent contract going to be awarded for Tornado. I suppose what I should mention really is the fact that on the contract and procurement side, there is certainly a difficulty here with understaffing in Germany MOD as a whole, because I spoke with a source and they had mentioned that this is kind of well known within German industry, that there is an understaffing problem, and the fact now that the procurement agencies are going to have to be signing off medical equipment contracts and things of that nature will ultimately mean that there's going to be pressure to come for contracts that should be awarded in the medium to short term, and certainly they're now going to become a lower priority for sure. Probably I should also reiterate on that type of headache isn't being spoken of by the German MOD themselves. That's from a source that I spoke to within academia and research. So, but I think it's you've got to hold that up as quite important, because we're probably not going to get to the meat and bones of every single difficulty that's going to be worked through, particularly as COVID-19 issues move forward.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the idea that we can sit here in our comfy studio and sort of prophesize as to what might impact industry in the next sort of weeks and months, that's a little bit of a long shot for us. I think what we'll see is a long, drawn-out, difficult period for industry and everyone involved with the defence military industrial base in sort of trying to prioritise, obviously, programmes, as you mentioned, that they have working forward to recapitalise fleets, to modernise armoured vehicles, to redevelop or develop new next-gen air vehicles. But obviously, at the first and foremost, they have to try and see how they can best contribute. This is defences, this is industry, in providing the medical equipment and capabilities, logistical capabilities, for example, that countries will need to help fight the virus.
Yeah, definitely. I think Germany also is quite almost an interesting case study, just because of the fact that their delays and complications, there's almost happened consistently across our land and sea. So I mentioned the F125. There's also the Puma IFV, of course, we know of those problems, and the A400M, the tanker, the transport aircraft as well. Now, of course, that's a multinational problem, and that program had difficulties beyond Germany. So everyone across the consortium in Europe had problems with that. But I think now that you're beginning to see, and also because politically there's so many highly divisive areas that often come up in the German parliament in terms of how they put forward their spending plans and what they spend their money on in defence as well. And, we know, of course, in terms of arming UAVs, they spiked plans to do that in December of last year. Highly contentious issues we're talking about, and slightly different, I would say, to maybe the UK, where yes, of course, we kind of speak of their problems and delays with procurements and things of that nature, but I would, and it's a risk of generalising, I suppose. There's almost a wide consensus of where the RAF priorities should lie, and where the naval priorities lie, cross-party, I would say, and that is absolutely not the case when it comes to Germany. And yes, we also know that history and that has a huge bearing on this, and repeating those is probably not worth really doing at this point. But I do think that Germany definitely is, certainly to keep an eye on developments there, because they are how things move forward in terms of defence in a time of crisis is absolutely worth taking note of.
Yeah, thanks, Sim. Really good analysis. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.
All right, thanks, Rich.
Coming up on the podcast, VP Content Tony Skinner speaks with Shepherd Media's CEO Darren Lake about the implications of so many defence exhibitions being delayed or cancelled due to the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. But first, Maya Nawins, IISS Research Fellow for Chinese Defence Policy and Military Modernisation, discusses China's military developments, how its doctrine supports its aims, and the strategic intentions over key infrastructure efforts such as the Belt and Road and String of Pearls initiatives.
We wanted to take a short break into the podcast to tell you about Shepherd Studio. Studio is our branded content offering, which gives industry a more creative way to tell their stories. Shepherd Studio works closely with companies and event organisers in the aerospace and defence industry to provide bespoke, co-branded solutions, whether it is supporting a particular campaign, content surrounding a major trade show, or bringing Studio on board to more effectively tell a company's story. Studio has already been adopted by many of the major defence primes, including Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Viasat. If you're interested in learning more about Studio projects and how they could benefit your company, please visit us at www.shepherd.studio.
Well, joining me is Maya Nawins, a IISS Research Fellow for Chinese Defence Policy and Military Modernisation. Maya, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, Richard.
So we're obviously going to talk about China. What influences has China had in modernising its military? And I guess the question is it doing this with its own blueprint, or is it copying the structure of other militaries and applying it to its own?
Well, I think that's a great question. The Chinese will undoubtedly say that they are modernizing their military according to their own plans and that everything is unique. But I think a lot of them, if you look at PLA analysts and experts and officials and their writings, they will acknowledge the lessons that they've learned from looking at both the successes and failures of other militaries, namely that of the United States. And I think a prime example here, of course, is China's push towards something called informationization. Looking more towards systems of systems operations and network-centric warfare, which it really took as a lesson from the United States example of fighting in the Gulf War.
So has China identified, I suppose, failures in terms of how the US has gone about conducting operations and how the US has recognized the need to modernize its own structures, and so China is following suit. Does that run the risk of China forever playing catch up to the US in terms of doctrine?
That's really interesting. I think that they'll have to find their own way. One thing that China is very keen on not doing, I think, and we'll get to this later, I believe, in your questions, is getting embroiled into third party or third country wars and conflicts. So getting bogged down in other conflicts is something that they're very keen to avoid. And that, of course, begs the question of what type of military the PLA will be in the future once it does modernize and feels more confident as an actor. But I think there are elements of the PLA and its modernization thus far and its reforms as pushed forward by President Xi Jinping that are unique. For example, the creation of the Strategic Support Force, which is one that is an entirely dedicated force within the People's Liberation Army dedicated to cyber operations, space operations, and electronic warfare.
Okay, I mean, we've known for a long time that China has a quantitative edge over NATO, but is the qualitative edge reducing as China's industry and its design and its sort of testing and training improves?
I mean, that's certainly the hope on President Xi Jinping's part as the leader of the Central Military Commission. There's two focuses really here that are important to this question. One is the ability of the PLA to actually fight and win wars. So a really big emphasis is placed at the moment on being able to be combat ready. And to do so, there's been a great push towards blue and red teaming to make exercises and drills as realistic as possible, even to some extent punishing or publicizing drills that were not realistic, where live fire exercises were not included, for example, and in that way shaming commanders even that haven't adhered to these new requirements. So they certainly hope that. The other element, of course, of the qualitative deficit would be the actual systems and platforms that the PLA is able to use. And for this, we look at China's defense, technological, and industrial base and how that is modernizing and reforming under President Xi Jinping. And again, there's been a push to integrate the civilian and the defense industries through military-civil fusion. This, I think, will take some time to work out. If it does in the end, is a question, of course, because these are two industries with very different cultures. But it's a national priority at the moment under this president. And the IISS last year conducted some research that led to a methodology by which we could rank Chinese state-owned enterprises that are present in the defense industry according to their revenue derived from defense products. And in doing so, we were able to show that actually the defense industry, the 8 of China's state-owned enterprises that are active in the field of defense rank amongst the top 22 of global defense companies if you look at Defense News's.
Now, we've seen examples of other countries around the world operating a new sort of hybrid warfare style of operations, and obviously China is looking and paying close attention to that. Now, I've heard it described as China's 3 warfares doctrine, which is essentially hybrid warfare. How's that been created by China, and what's its purpose?
So I think there's a bit of a confusion, actually, between hybrid warfare and the 3 warfares. The 3 warfares are a little bit different than just thinking about little blue men in terms of maritime militia that cooperate with the PLA Navy or Coast Guard in the South China Sea, or the little green men that Russia leverages. So the 3 warfares are psychological warfare, which is an operation that influences the target's psychology and behavior. A public opinion warfare is the second one, which is an operation that generates public support domestically and internationally by sending out selected information via various media platforms. And legal warfare is, of course, the use of laws, international law, in order to position one's own political initiatives within a larger framework and more solid position. I would say that these 3 together are not exactly the same as hybrid warfare, simply because they're there to shape the environment in which the PLA operates. We have to understand that whilst the 3 warfares were entered into the revised political work guidelines of the People's Liberation Army in 2003, actually they are the 3 warfares are part of a much larger picture, which is political warfare. And political warfare has been central to the People's Liberation Army and to the Chinese Communist Party since the 1960s, 1950s even. So it's not entirely comparable, I would say.
Sure. I mean, so effectively what you've got with hybrid warfare is a capability. And it sounds like what you've described there with 3 warfares is very much a concept of operations, like an overarching umbrella in which all the political guidance and sort of military structure falls underneath that.
Sure, of course. And also the PLA is only one part of that puzzle, right? There are plenty of other institutions within the Chinese system that also work on the 3 warfares and contribute to the 3 warfares and shaping that environment in which the army will ultimately operate.
Okay, so then what is the role of the People's Liberation Army in China's doctrine? I mean, it's quite sizable. It's got a lot of military capabilities, an awful lot of armored vehicles. Is it an occupying force? Is it just a blunt instrument?
The role of the PLA is twofold. It has an internal role, and it has for, I would say, a significant amount of time had an internal role over an external role. And this really goes back to China's doctrine of people's warfare, which is drawing the enemy in, wearing them out, and then expelling them, and thereby attaining victory. But actually, that has transformed these days into something called active defense, whereby the arena of conflict is really pushed away from China's littoral, away from China's shores, further into the Asia-Pacific arena. And so with that, the PLA and safeguarding national territory, of course, becomes a more of an externally focused force. So it's both internal and external. Of course, the PLA is not just the country's army, it is actually the Communist Party's army. And that, again, is something that's quite different, I think, for Western military observers to understand that the People's Liberation Army is not there just to protect the country. It is also there to ensure political stability for the Communist Party of China, and also to ensure the survivability of the Communist Party of China. So I would say that the focus at the moment is internal. It's shifting increasingly externally. But again, we have two goals for we have three goals that the PLA needs to attain, and that is by 2021, it needs to have achieved basic mechanization and made progress on informationization. Likely that it will not achieve that goal by the end of this year to its fullest. By 2035, the PLA needs to be a fully modernized force. And by 2049, the PLA needs to be a global top-tier force that is able to fight and win wars. Now, I would say that the 2035 goal and the 2049 goal are also geographically focused goals. So the 2035 goal is a regional goal whereby the PLA must by 2035 be able to displace the United States as the main security actor, the main military actor in the Asia-Pacific region. By 2049, it will have a more global role. So although now we're seeing the PLA make progress on its ability to conduct operations further and further away from the Chinese coast, such as its exercises in the Baltic and in the Mediterranean. I think these are still nascent. They're still early in their long trajectory, and to get to a blue water navy, there's still quite a way to go. Again, as I said at the start of the podcast segment, I think that the PLA and Chinese leadership will be wary of being a force that invades other countries to serve national interest or become embroiled into third-party conflicts simply because the Chinese don't adhere to alliances in the way that Western countries do. Its only ally, officially speaking, is the DPRK. And second of all, I think the Chinese are interested first and foremost on, again, maintaining CCP dominance and leadership and superiority within the country. And with that comes an economic question. So securing sea lanes is, of course, vital. And that's where I think we'll see Chinese overseas military presence.
It's very interesting. Sort of contrasting the efforts of China's Navy to increase its sort of ship holds. The US Navy is going through its own sort of very, very difficult process of trying to increase the number of ships it has at its disposal. But already China's fleet is far in excess of what the US Navy can actually put to sea. I think China's current fleet of 345 vessels, I think it is projected to increase to about 420 by 2035. So that's one of the timelines that you mentioned there. If China can increase the size of its fleet to 420, do you think it's possible that it can surpass the US Navy in terms of sea dominance in the Asia-Pacific region?
Interesting, yet difficult question to answer. I think it's, of course, useful to take the progress of China's shipbuilding up to this point and draw a straight line trajectory to estimate what it could be by 2035. But I think we should be cautious of doing so. China at the moment is undergoing economic slowdown. The current situation of COVID-19 will have had a significant impact on the Chinese economy. We know the defense industry was also paused. We don't quite know to what extent that's coming online now, whilst China recovers from the impact of the epidemic. So I think we should be cautious by making those very straight trajectory lines. Of course, the Chinese have an ambition, and that's where I will give them the benefit of the doubt. There is political will to achieve superiority by 2035. The question, of course, is whether that is possible. It's not just shipbuilding that matters here, but it's also the qualitative factor of, you have to man the ships. So is recruitment and retention going to fall in step with that very rapid shipbuilding lineup? Is our training and exercises going to be enough? Is the PLA's naval doctrine, warfighting doctrine, going to be able to be limber enough to change where it needs to in order for carrier strike groups, for example, to work in coordination? I think these are all questions. And even when we looked at the, assumption that some people make of China building 6 aircraft carriers, there have been reports coming out of China last year that actually the Chinese will probably build 4 aircraft carriers, not 6 in the next few years, because of technical challenges that they're facing and economic and financial challenges that they're facing with their current plans of 4 aircraft carriers. So again, I would be cautious about those numbers and those trajectories.
Just finally, Mayor, this question I've got about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, I think this is obviously an economic plan, a political plan, a way to sort of make sure that China is able to get the resources it needs to keep growing its economy, export an awful lot of its own sort of political ideas and culture. Also, does this Belt and Road Initiative, if a nation is provided with huge loans to provide maritime infrastructure in terms of ports, and then these nations are unable to repay these loans, does this in theory potentially gives China access to a number of different naval bases in regions and oceans that maybe it wouldn't have otherwise been able to get access to? So if this is a valid concern, is there a potential counter to the militarization of the Belt and Road Initiative?
The militarization of the Belt and Road Initiative is a widely discussed topic. And when it comes to the string of pearls theory that you're referring to, which is that China will build ports and invest in port infrastructure throughout the Indian Ocean in order to use such ports as dual-use facilities for the PLA Navy and thereby dominate the region, I think that this is something that we haven't really seen happen yet. What I think is also important is how we think about the PLA Navy, and again, what type of role it will play at the moment in terms of securing Belt and Road Initiative projects. That's more of what I would think about when I think about the security around the Belt and Road Initiative is how these projects and investments themselves are being secured from possible attack and threats, as they are being, as these investments do take place in increasingly unstable countries and areas of conflict. And here we see the role of of Chinese private security companies gaining ground. And again, not the case of boots on the ground. Now, will China need bases for a blue water navy? Will it need access to ports for maintenance and repair? Of course it will, as a logistic necessity. But I question when that will happen. And I think we also need to think a little bit more carefully about which ports we consider. Not every port that China invests in is the same. Not every investment project is the same. China participates in port projects from construction of entirely new ports to revamping existing ports. Some of them don't involve construction at all, and it's just an investment in the port authority. So then again, you need to question, well, what level of investment is that? Does a Chinese company or a state-owned enterprise become a majority stakeholder in a port authority? And what does that mean for control over that port? But again, will China need bases and port access for a blue water navy? Yes. Again, the question for me is when. For me, at the moment, again, the priority for the PLA is closer to home than more globally. Taiwan is an outstanding problem for the PLA and for the Chinese leadership. Similarly, the concerns around territorial integrity, Hong Kong, South China Sea, East China Sea, these are all the most pressing core interests that the PLA will be focusing on for the next few years until they're resolved.
Fascinating discussion. Maya Nowitz, thank you very much. IISS Research Fellow for Chinese Defence Policy, and military modernization. Maya, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, did you know that Shepherd Media is fully digital?
Yeah, of course. I've already downloaded the app. I love that I can access high-quality stories anywhere, anytime. That's good for when you're deployed, right?
I actually like that the stories don't waste my time. It's like the editors know what and when I want to read.
And that you don't have to read them. You can watch a video or check out the infographics.
Yeah, it's ace. Did you see that piece on Iran? That piece on the Tor M1 air defense system where they
Download the free Shepherd News app on the App Store and Google Play, and you can get 3 months half price on Shepherd Premium News for a limited time.
So as we've been hearing, the world continues to suffer from the ongoing coronavirus. A lot of the world now is in lockdown. There's wide-ranging long-term ramifications that will only become clear in the near term. We want to take, I guess, a narrower look at our piece of the world, which is the defence industry. Life's essentially ground to a halt. So to chat through what it means for us as a business and for the wider industry, I've got on the line Darren Lake, who's the CEO here at Shepherd.
Hey, Tony.
Darren, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks.
So just to kick things off, we're all working from home. I'm once again under my duvet recording this. How is this affecting business, and what's life like at Shepherd at the moment?
Well, I'm not quite under my duvet, although I have gone somewhere with some more soft furnishings, so hopefully the recording quality's better. For us, it's been a relatively natural transition. We've been a business that's worked remotely and worked from home quite a lot. So we were relatively well prepared as a business to move to working from home. From our point of view, it's also been relatively good that we made that digital transition that we talked about last time I was on the podcast at the beginning of the year. It means we can continue to reach the audiences that we serve, even now that they're all working from home, and they wouldn't be picking up copies of a magazine in the office because nobody's in an office at the moment.
Yeah, I guess we don't have a crystal ball to have predicted this is going to happen. I mean, yeah, as we talked about last time, the move to digital was obviously a reflection of changing reading habits anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in terms of the podcast views, we had a massive spike last week, I guess, as people were at home looking for things to do. Our bread and butter, I guess, is attending trade shows, defence exhibitions. What do we know to date about the status of some of the big events like, Eurosatory and Farnborough?
Yeah, well, trade press and trade shows go hand in hand, right? And we were just about to ramp up into the main spring and early summer trade show schedule, which is where we get to see customers and clients, where we get the journalists out there to ask the awkward questions of the companies. At the moment, my feeling with this, looking into my crystal ball, is that there won't be any defence exhibitions, certainly at least until the back half of summer, so sort of talking August onwards. So I think, Farnborough's been cancelled. About the only one that's not actually officially cancelled at the moment is Eurosatory, and I just don't see at this point something in June happening.
It's hard to sort of to gauge or to overstate the ramifications here in terms of what it means for an industry. I guess my first trade show was the Paris Air Show in 2005. And since then, my kind of annual schedule has been dictated by the cycle of these shows. What are companies going to miss in terms of not being able to go engage with the industry, engage with the community, at these big events?
Well, it's something we talked about as a team yesterday, and we sort of tried to classify what people were looking for in this trade show environment, what they were going to those trade shows for.
as a business. I think, our clients have always been looking at trade shows for, brand messaging, for product launches, for informing people about existing products that they have, for generating new leads for their business, and also importantly for renewing their contacts with an existing clients and existing customers. So I think those are the things that we certainly go to a trade show for, and I think that's a reflection of why anybody really goes to a trade show.
When we had the last recession, certainly a lot of the defence budgets were reduced, sort of contracted, and companies at that point downgraded their prices. Some companies pulled out of the events trade show circuit, the main ones, and there was an expectation that maybe a lot of other companies would sort of follow, but that didn't really happen back then. So obviously, I guess what I'm trying to say is companies still value the physical presence of being able to see a lot of people in one place, get their brand awareness out there. Are companies looking at alternative measures, alternative means to engage with the community?
Yeah, I mean, this has been one of these perennial discussions, hasn't it? I mean, how useful, what are trade shows for? Is the dawn of the internet going to change the need for business travel? Are we moving to a future of virtual events? And we're certainly not there yet. The technology isn't there to do that. Human interactions, you don't get those, and I think that's crucially one of the most important things. Mm-hmm. From what I've seen so far, companies are approaching this in different ways. Some are hunkering down and just deciding that without the trade shows, it's very difficult to do any kind of marketing. I think that's probably a mistake. I think some of the companies I've seen doing interesting things are sort of looking at things like using Zoom or any other sort of video conferencing type of thing to do sort of meets and greets and briefings and have interesting discussions that they would otherwise be having at shows, and trying to reach the audiences that they want to hear those messages. I think that's where we can crucially play a good part, because, what we do is develop audiences and develop content that engages audiences. So that's where we're focusing our time and effort at the moment.
It seems perhaps a little bit crass to talk about opportunities in a crisis like this, but there is potentially opportunities for the trade press to start to, provide some of those solutions.
I think if we're respectful, if we do it in the right way, and we do it in a way that aligns with our customer base's needs and requirements, then it's certainly something we can help to facilitate. You're right. Nobody wants to take advantage of the situation. But those of us who've invested in various types of engagement, various types of content, various types of audience segmentation are in a position to help industry through what is going to be a very difficult and probably protracted crisis.
So, crystal ball gazing again, when would you expect the community to be able to get back together again? I mean, if we sort of look, there are very few events in August and September anyway. So is it likely going to be AUSA in October?
I think for the sort of the global land sector side of things, I think that's probably certainly going to be the case. I think it still waits to be seen whether some of the events that have been moved to sort of the August timeframe actually can happen. There's a lot of things to worry about in terms of, network capacity on airlines and those kinds of things, how quickly things get back to normal. But I'm certainly saying, what we're looking around sort of AUSA, those end of year shows. And then from the aerospace side of things, we may well be looking, further ahead into next year before we get back to some semblance of normal.
I guess what we do know at this stage is that the entire crisis itself has given everything a shake-up, not least the defence industry. So looking at the trade show circuit into next year, life will likely be very different. Darren, any final thoughts before we sign off?
I think, finally, all I'd like to say really is that, we all need to do the socially responsible thing at the moment and do what we're being asked to do. And that's the best that any of us can do at the moment. Hopefully we'll be back, or I'll be back, or you might let me back on the podcast to have another conversation in a few weeks' time to see how we're doing and the kind of things that we're doing. But apart from that, I just say everybody stay safe.
So welcome to this week's Industry Voice segment, which is a part of the show that's brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Nemo. So I'm Tony Skinner, VP of Content here at Shift Media, and I'm on the phone with Ondra Lond, who is the SVP of Communications for Nemo. So good afternoon, Ondra.
Good afternoon, Tony.
So it's the strangest of times at the moment. I mean, I'm recording
Indeed
in my bedroom under a duvet. Hopefully my toddler of a son won't make too much noise. You know, clearly the impact of COVID-19, the coronavirus, continues to make a huge global impact. In a lot of ways, there's really nothing else to talk about. But I think just things a little bit lighter this week, it would be good perhaps to chat about some of the working from home strategies. You know, certainly, as a company, we're finding sort of new ways to keep in touch with our employees. You know, I'm finding that getting into routines is very helpful. I mean, at your end, how are you guys sort of finding things?
Yeah, we're looking at many of the same things, right? Like as you are, as I think pretty much every other company in the world is doing right now. But what we've started looking at is not just working from home, but it's also leading from home. Because it's the transition into working from home is just as big for leaders, and it does pose even greater demands on the leaders in terms of how they should and need to follow up their employees. There was some research that I learned of last week, which says that after about 10 days of working from home, you will see a significant increase in stress and anxiety among at least parts of your workforce, which could actually persist long after this current situation is ended. It's just the isolation, it's the sense of being cut off from your daily routines, from your colleagues. You have to remember, for a lot of people, their office is a very important part of their daily social life. This is where they meet some people they spend the most time with ever. And being cut off from them for so long without really having an alternative, they can't really go on vacation, they can't really leave, they have to still work. There's a major shift.
And I guess there's various elements to it. I mean, one, I guess, is how the managers manage their direct reports, and making sure that they're getting the feedback they need, and that they feel secure with the tasks they're carrying out. The other is, I guess, the more socialization, the more social part of the job.
Yes,
your colleagues, going for a cup of tea, chatting to people in the staff room, all that aspect, which I guess you don't realize how much you rely on it until it's gone, really, do you?
No, not at all. And in an office environment, you can always rely on the employee themselves and their direct colleagues, perhaps helping each other with this. They'll head out for a cup of tea together, or they'll have some sort of social events or just conversations when they meet around the coffee machine. That's harder to achieve in a digital environment, and you as a manager really have to lean into to make sure that happens. We've set up 5 specific guidelines for our managers, and they mainly go on, like, we have to be very clear in terms of expectations and goals, put structure into communications and meetings, make sure you have regular check-ins, that people will have ownership to their own schedules and goals and agendas and what they're going to achieve, and also in terms of how you're going to give feedback. But what you just mentioned there, like, you have to deal with the fact of, well, it's going to be boredom. You sit alone. And your tasks can end up feeling very monotonous. There's no break in terms of, like, moving physically to a meeting room and back and forth. And just that social isolation social distancing that we're all being encouraged to do, takes a toll. So as a leader, you have to look at both the work and the person, and much more so than you would do in a normal office environment.
And I guess the other element, which is interesting, is the role that technology has played. we use sort of video conferencing, I guess, sparingly, but we've really embraced the last sort of 2 weeks. And pretty much I think I've had more meetings over the last couple of days over video conference than I have in person in the office. But they are over video, so you can see the other person and you get all those, the non-verbal cues, which are important, which you obviously lose in an email or sort of written communications.
Yes, exactly. And that's also important to try and maintain. It's just seeing a face and encouraging people, even though I'm just sitting at home, I haven't really done all my prep that I would do before I leave the house normally. But actually seeing a face and communicating by video rather than audio, it's so important. It's a very, very different thing. Mm-hmm. So even though it's tempting to just do things by voice, you should sometimes actually insist on it, that you need to put up the camera and so on. I think what we've learned in our company is that when this all passes, then we are going to at least prepare for and equip offices and everything even better than we have today for video conferencing, facilitate it much more. Because we're seeing that it does have some benefits, and it allows you to do a lot of meetings and follow up much more regularly than you would have done if you have now we have to set up time, we have to go into that meeting, have to physically move and so on. There's certain benefits to it also that we can kind of retain long term, even after all this is done and we can hopefully return more or less to normal operations. There's certain things that perhaps we will take with us as lessons learned, things we can carry on later.
Yeah, certainly I'm sure there's a fair proportion of people that have never worked from home before for any time, if at all. So, their exposure to the practice, I guess like you say, the organizations getting themselves set up for this, for this way of working. Yeah, I'm sure these effects will be long lasting.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who used to have this fear of I can never get the video to work, I can never get the screen sharing to work, and so on and so on. Well, now you can't be forced to figure that out. And I think there's a lot of people who now, after a couple of weeks of this, the threshold is much lower for doing this.
And nowadays they're very reliable services. I won't name check the one that we use, but it's a very good software. And sort of no excuses these days, I guess.
Nope. And even less so after this. Now everyone's been through it. Everyone's tested. Everyone's tried. And I can do this. It's actually possible. It's actually possible to do this effectively. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of long-term effects this is going to cause.
Andre, we'll check in with you again next time. I'm sure there'll be other ramifications from the current crisis that we'll be able to talk about. But in the meantime, you stay safe and enjoy working from home.
Likewise. Speak soon.
This episode of the Weekly Defence Podcast was brought to you in partnership with our sponsor, Nemo. As always, a big thanks to everyone that took the time in being a part of the episode. And for our listeners, make sure you like and subscribe, leave a review on iTunes, and tell a friend or a colleague about the podcast. Until next week, thanks for listening.